Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 30 of This Week is Live. That's right, we can't believe it either. It's been 30 episodes that we've been telling you stories and also recapping headlines from the world of entertainment. So glad to see you well. Thanks for joining us. This is one of those rare times where there's so much going on that probably could have done this show four different ways. There's so much information and so much news happening on so many different fronts, but don't have time to sit here for 5 hours recapping headlines. So we tried to make the best choice we can. But this is literally one of those times where there's stuff kind of cascading and happening in almost every different direction. Now, as a programming note, before we get into today's headlines, just wanted to let you all know, for any of you who are usually engaging with our content here, either on the live stream or and where we post everything on YouTube after the fact, that we're going to be on hiatus for a couple of weeks. Next week, when we would usually broadcast this show live, our games editor and I, Zach Dalton, will be at what's called Summer Game Fest, which is quickly becoming the heir apparent to take over where E3 has basically disappeared. And Summer Game Fest is kind of a private thing, and effectively what's happening there is, not for public consumption. It's a big press event, and we're going to be there experiencing games, many of which under embargo or off the record, and then coverage to come for many weeks after that. So there's going to be a lot of preparation for next week, as there's many big video game conferences and also what's happening at Summer Game Fest. And then effectively, I'm going to be traveling the week after that, and I'm going to be heading to see my family, and I'm going to be gone for a week. There's a possibility maybe I'll do a brief little thing remotely as I'm traveling while I'm away, but most likely we're going to be off the air for the next 2 weeks. So why don't we dive right into it? Let's start with our first story, which is very much hot off the presses as of last night, which is the famed actor Danny Masterson, who many of you may know from that 70s show many decades ago, was very popular in its time, and many different careers like Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher basically all came, Topher Grace all came from that show. Well, Danny Masterson has officially been found guilty of rape. Now, there has been a long-standing court case kind of traveling its way through the Los Angeles court system that 3 different women had accused him as a part of either dating him or knowing him or having met him that they had been raped by him. And there was a trial that basically came to fruition in November that ended in a mistrial. And effectively, the jury was deadlocked and ultimately had not decided on, whether they could find him guilty or innocent. And effectively, this was the retrial. So now what's important in the midst of this is that he has been found guilty for 2 of the 3 women whose cases had been brought to trial against him. And the third case, which was brought by Chrissy Carnell Bixler, famously the wife of the Mars Volta's lead singer Cedric Bixler Zavala, they were still deadlocked on her case. So Chrissy Carnell Bixler Danny Masterson was not found guilty, but the other 2 women, who are listed only as Jane Does at this point, have not publicly revealed themselves. He was found guilty. Now, Masterson faces 30 years to life sentencing behind this. That sentencing hasn't been announced yet. We'll obviously bring you that news once it's happened, but this has been really kind of an ugly series of events, and it also swirls all around the Church of Scientology and his basically place in the religion, and that is his whole own story we're not even going to basically go into, but it was brought into the trial, and effectively they were allowed to talk about matters related to the Church of Scientology in the trial by the judge, because the accusers basically had been former Scientologists, and they didn't contact law enforcement because they basically feared that they would be labeled a suppressive person within the Church of Scientology. They believed that a part of the culture of that church was a part of not bringing things like this to light. When somebody prominent as a part of the church had something, basically wrongdoing attached to them, or potentially allegedly attached to them, and they had been told, or they claimed they had been told allegedly by the church, that the accusations would be handled internally, and of course nothing ever was. So the trial has finally happened, and he has been found guilty and was immediately arrested following the trial and is awaiting sentencing. Prior to this, he was a part of a show called The Ranch with Ashton Kutcher, which was kind of a weird, laugh track sitcom show, and he was basically removed and fired from that show in the wake of the allegations coming out. And there's also now that 70s show kind of like reboot happening that is effectively, featuring a lot of the former characters, but with, either their children or younger denizens of the same place, kind of doing the same silly schlocky thing that show did. And of course, Danny Masterson is one of the only people from the original show that's totally not involved for these reasons. Cedric Bixler Zavala, the lead singer of the Mars Volta, has been an avid pundit for this case for obvious reasons, being that his wife was one of the three people involved, and effectively had been for years, if you paid attention to any of his social media, saying things about the Church of Scientology or saying things about, his claim of Masterson's guilt, and had briefly last night, right as the announcement came through, issued basically a statement on Instagram, basically, I guess you could say dancing on the grave of Danny Masterson and the conviction, and, then essentially deleted the Instagram post not long after that. And, essentially said something to the effect of, quote, Danny's helpers and rape apologists, we fucking told you. God bless the women that stood up to him and his shitty fucking family. Fuck Scientology. Rot in jail, Danny. So we'll have more news for you on this as more developments come through. And of course, as the sentencing happens, I would expect, just given the fame, stature, and wealth of Danny Masterson, I would expect appeals. I don't think this is the last you're going to hear of this case. And, much in the same vein as what's been going on with Bill Cosby, I don't think you're going to see this as the end of this story. But Danny Masterson convicted on 2 out of 3 counts of alleged rape. Elsewhere, in the world of video games and connecting to larger geopolitical affairs worldwide, the Nintendo eShop in Russia has been closed. Now, that seems like a small little thing, but it's an interesting kind of nuance to it. It's a very complicated thing. Now, obviously, last year in early 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. And effectively, most of the countries on earth think this is a bad thing. This is a bad thing. Russia refuses to brand this a war and essentially keeps constantly calling it a special military operation. And, the United States and most of the countries on earth in the developed world have basically been helping Ukraine with money, weapons, assistance, training, things to basically repel the entire Russian army, which they have kind of largely done. Now, one of the things that happened in the run-up of this was also putting pressure and pain on Russia for taking this act and trying to take this country, which does not belong to them, and effectively, try to thwart them from being able to succeed in that effect, which is sanctions, both in the way of sanctions against various of the famous Russian oligarchs that are beholden to Vladimir Putin, the country's president, but then also in terms of various businesses, the ruble as a currency, and effectively what basically has happened since there is a sanction on the ruble. Effectively, this is a part of the reason that the payment providers aren't allowing those payments to come through, and Nintendo is essentially making a calculation, enough is enough, we're not going to bother to run this anymore. So effectively, Russian customers that are fans of Nintendo or their games or downloads or getting downloads codes of them are no longer going to be able to purchase them from this time permanently, indefinitely going forward. And their statement on it was, as a result of the economic outlook, Nintendo of Europe has decided to wind down operations of its Russian subsidiary as part of our efforts to honor preceding commitments to our customers in the Russian market. The Russian version of Nintendo eShop will be set to offer limited service, according to Nintendo of Europe. And then as of May 31, 2023, and for the foreseeable future, Russian customers with an existing Nintendo account will be able to re-download digital content that they have previously purchased. It will not be possible to make any new purchases or use download codes within the Nintendo eShop in Russia. Elsewhere in the world of movies, there was a big release in this past weekend, and what has become kind of the barrel roll of the movie industry, trying very hard to get itself back into the normal swing of people going to movies following the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, Disney's big budget, very expensive, somewhat live action remake of The Little Mermaid, the remake of their early 90s animated classic, did massively well at the box office, especially considering whatever you want to call a post-pandemic world. And it did 118 million over the Memorial Day holiday weekend, and followed not far behind which, and in decent holds considering the time that they've been out, Fast X, the latest in the Fast and the Furious franchise, at 28 million, and then Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 holding really strong at 26 million. And effectively, this is going to be on the heels of what I would bet is going to be an even bigger moment, which is going to be the next chapter in the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse animated films, which was a giant breakout hit 6 years back, and effectively tells the story of Miles Morales, who is the first non-white character as a Spider-Man. And it was a wonderful movie in its own ways, kind of silly, but other ways very serious, and had a whole bunch of other variants of Spider-Man from across the different universe, not the least of which being Spider-Ham, which is a very silly version of Spider-Man that is a anthropomorphic pig, and effectively is just a breakout hit. Kids everywhere loved it. Adults loved it. It was a really smart, sharp movie at a time when it was pretty much perfect for it to happen. And effectively, this is the long awaited sequel that was kind of held down in delays because of the pandemic, production bottlenecks, and, basically able to keep everything moving in that respect. Now, estimates have this movie coming out at somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 90 million in the domestic sense in North America, and maybe 150 worldwide, but I wouldn't be surprised if those numbers are wildly underestimating the interest in this movie. And I mean, ask around if you don't know many kids, young kids who like superheroes, love Miles Morales in this movie. It's going to be a massive hit. Early reviews indicate that it's pretty much on par with the original in terms of quality, and that's a really good sign. So we'll have all that information for you next time that we come back. It might be a little bit after the fact since the hiatus that we're going to be on. Elsewhere in the world of music, the band Royal Blood performed at an event over the last week. And essentially, this being the Radio 1 event that happened in Camperdown Country Park, Dundee, Scotland. Apparently, basically more of a pop music event. And apparently, the two members, Mike Kerr and Ben Thatcher, didn't love the reaction they were getting or weren't getting from the crowd on hand. And essentially, basically, kind of took this as an opportunity to punk off on the whole event. And it's an interesting kind of moment to watch because it's super awkward. And they're a great band. They've always been a great band. We've done a lot of covers with Royal Blood early on in their career, and people interview them, take portrait shots with them, and they're a very big deal over the United Kingdom in a general sense, and which is probably why in a very pop-centric time where rock and roll isn't necessarily as big as it once was, and it's hard to be a rock band and be massively successful. They might have been one of the only bands on the bill that was kind of that genre and kind of form and function. Well, essentially, apparently, if you watch this video footage, and it's widely out there and social media, it's super awkward, and it's kind of hard to tell, not having been there through the whole experience, was the crowd really reacting to them, were people sitting on their hands and bored? But whatever the case may be, their reaction essentially, Mike Kerr, the lead singer, guitar player, basically responded and said, well, I guess I should introduce ourselves, seeing that as no one actually knows who we are. We're called Royal Blood, and this is rock music. Who likes rock music? 9 people. Brilliant. Effectively, he, made numerous quips saying that nobody was really applauding for them and that wanting people to applaud for them, and then kind of spent time looking at, I guess, various crew members on the side of the stage, essentially asking for them to applaud for them, describing what they were experiencing as pathetic, and then essentially at the end of 7 songs, they basically hit one giant, loud, open, distorted note, and then Kerr threw his guitar to the ground and basically held the 2 middle fingers up, as he walked away to behind him as he walked off the stage. Fascinating little moment, and probably a bigger story there that will come out in time. And then lastly, in what I would call, just a wow, kind of interesting moment as far as how things are created and how things take shape, there was news that came out just yesterday about Queen and quite literally Freddie Mercury's notions of what became Bohemian Rhapsody. Now, Bohemian Rhapsody was a song done in 1975 for their album A Night at the Opera, and it was for the time, incredibly long pop music song. It's 6 minutes long. And in America, also set the record for the longest it ever took a song to go to number 1 because it had a big resurgence in popularity here, and the whole world, but essentially in the United States most of all, because at the time, Wayne's World was incredibly popular, and Wayne's World was a bit that came from Saturday Night Live that was done by Mike Myers and Dana Carvey playing the characters Wayne and Garth. And there was a hilarious and famous little bit where they're driving down the road in their very crappy car, the Mirthmobile, and they're singing along, pantomiming to it. And then, of course, when the infamous part after the operatic sequence happens where heavy guitars come in and they're all headbanging, and it just became kind of legendary as a famous moment in cinema. And of course, in 1991, when this all happened, caused that song to finally go to number 1 in North America. And it's a amazing, incredible song. If you don't know Bohemian Rhapsody, stop what you're doing, stop watching this show, go listen to Bohemian Rhapsody. At this point, I doubt very many people watching this aren't familiar with Bohemian Rhapsody. But for those of you that haven't, if you're a bit younger and you're not really familiar with the song, do yourself a favor and go, because kind of the operatic heights of what rock and roll could be, especially in that era, going all those decades back. So what's interesting is that when Freddie Mercury passed away, ultimately succumbing to, at the time, the rampant AIDS epidemic going around the world. And, of course, in that early wave where people were first really becoming aware of the threat of it, and he passed away not long after this happened in 1991. Most of his personal effects went to his longtime partner and friend, Mary Austin, and she basically kept care of them and in the house where they all were for decades since then. And essentially, after having cared for them for a long time, she's decided to put them up for auction with Sotheby's. And there's all kinds of stuff in there, basically handwritten notes and gear and clothing and apparel and stuff that, they wore as part of shows and video shoots and other stuff like that. And what's really interesting is some of the stuff is handwritten lyric sheets, and apparently a bunch of them written on pieces of paper or stationery from like long defunct airlines. And many of them have numerous iterative drafts of songs that he was working on or lyrics that he was working on. And of course, most interestingly in this one, Bohemian Rhapsody. Now, Bohemian Rhapsody basically being worked on for a long time before it happened. What's really fascinating about this is that in one of the drafts, there is literally written the words Mongolian Rhapsody, and then the word Mongolian is crossed out, and then the word Bohemian is put on top of it. So at one point, even if it was just briefly, there was a thought that maybe the song that is one of the most famous Queen songs there is, along with, say, We Will Rock You or We Are the Champions, was being considered to be called Mongolian Rhapsody. And a lot of the true meaning of the song, you can speculate till the cows come home over the lyricism in that song and what it's really about. And Queen has famously never really commented on it. But fascinating wrinkle, like how that ties into it. People are probably going to dissect and debate for quite a long time what that does or doesn't have to do with anything. But it also interesting little details is that there were certain lyrics changes that were never really incorporated and that were what it was originally thought until it ultimately became. Famously, one of the lines in Bohemian Rhapsody is Mama just killed a man, put my gun against his head, pulled my trigger, now he's dead. And apparently that lyric was, Mama, there's a war began. I've got to leave tonight. Fascinating little piece of history. Now, as we wrap up here this week, I wanted to tell a story about one of what I would call one of the better albums that I can possibly think of. And this album, to me, will always be known as Ocean Machine, and the name of the album is Biomech. Now, if you were to go buy this record in a modern sense, it goes by the moniker Devin Townsend, because that's the artist who basically wrote and created the whole thing. And then now the album is rebranded Ocean Machine Biomech. So by the way of a little backstory. So Devin Townsend was a Canadian musician who basically came up in the early 90s. And the first time that most people heard of him was as the singer and kind of like really impressive screamer. That was the first time Steve Vai had his own heavy metal band, which was somewhat unoriginally just called Vai. And as Vai kind of did their thing for a little bit, had a album, had a tour, Devin Townsend started to branch out on his own because he was his own musician and he had his own ideas. He had a project called Noisescapes he was shopping around. And then as he is told, and there's a long series of YouTube videos, he did a podcast himself where he went in depth and detail into what, was the background of this time in this era. He had material that was kind of starting to formulate that was what became his very famous band, Strapping Young Lad. And then he had material that was what became what we're talking about here, which is Ocean Machine. Now, Strapping Young Lad was, industrial tech metal, right? In the vein of Fear Factory. It was muscular. It was super aggressive. I wouldn't describe it as macho in any way, but it was anger of like the train going off the tracks, the sound of self-destruction, and is wildly heralded as one of the best metal things to come from the early 90s by serious metal fans. Ocean Machine, on the other hand, was a much more quieter and atmospheric kind of journey, what I would almost call textured music. And maybe perhaps the origins of what became common in Devin's career as a progressive rock musician. But I always thought of this as kind of what Soundgarden was scratching at, but I never knew that Soundgarden accomplished this as well as what Devin did with the Ocean Machines album. Soundgarden, of course, coming from that like grunge lineage and were an excellent grunge band, and then started to kind of evolve their sound, and it was certainly good. And many people love everything that Soundgarden did in the aftermath of the Mad Boner Figure years. But I never thought it was really quite to the level that they were hoping it would be. Now, this all happened because famously, and Devin talks about this in the podcast that I'm mentioning, that essentially when he was in high school, there was a friend of his, there was a close friend of his that was famously, where he lived in Canada, stabbed to death, basically attempted to be robbed and stabbed to death, never really solved, an unsolved murder. And, devastating. And numerous of the songs on this record speak to that loss, that rumination on life and death, mortality, life, the afterlife. And also, one of the things that really great is this pervasive sense of, in that, like, Ralph Waldo Emerson, kind of Henry David Thoreau way, that man trying to find meaning in nature, the world, the cosmos, existence, and trying to understand it all, sifting through that. Someone, one person against the elements. And effectively, what you get with this record, which in those days was immensely hard to find, is a just kind of beautiful, beautiful record of someone who's clearly coming from a little bit more of a rock and roll kind of vein, trying to evolve into something else. And that's very much what the record feels like. It feels like somebody who maybe doesn't have the lexicon or the knowledge of doing atmospheric or ambient music or, lush balladry, and trying everything in their power to reach towards those things, to go past their comfort zone, to go past their limitations and their boundaries. And it is a magnificent, beautiful record. Now, in those days, it came out in July of 1997. It was an incredibly hard record to get. Didn't really have United States distribution at first. So the people that I knew that had it were all people who had bought it on import from Japan. So literally, it was released on a sub-imprint within Sony Japan. And, in those days, for those of you that don't know, obviously most people, even young people watching this, are aware of compact discs and cassettes and things like that, and how that was the dominant medium of music distribution in those days. But when it came to records like this, sometimes there wasn't a United States label that had them. And this was really popular in the circle, in the space of import records and effectively, remixes and stuff like that. So there was this like really robust community of people who would pay way too much money, sometimes $20, $30, $40 for some version of an album on import, because it would usually have bonus tracks or songs that were never released in terms of a North American release, which is hilarious when you think of it nowadays, because if it comes out in one territory now, it comes out everywhere. And I mean, no one would even dream of paying $30 for a handful of songs, but I did it myself a whole bunch in the 90s. There was all kinds of rare Nine Inch Nails releases, for example, that had, rare cuts that didn't come out in terms of any readily accessible North American release. So this is for like those uber nerds that were really big into a particular band or the remixes of that band. So the people I knew basically had to buy this on import for way too much money, and then, essentially made copies for other people, and either they're dubbing to cassette, or later when there was finally MP3 technology, taking a rip of it there, because it was just impossible to get, and then eventually released by Devin's own Heavy Devi record label. The album basically starts with kind of a small, like, mutated version of an Alfred, Lord Tennyson poem, and the words are, "O earth, what changes hast thou seen? There where the long street roars hath been the hills are shadows, and they flow from form to form, and nothing stands. They melt like mist, the solid lands, like clouds they shape themselves and go." And that's basically what opens into the song, The Seventh Wave, that basically begins the record. And from there, it just becomes a more and more lush rumination on the various pieces of what the story is and the things that Devin was, in his own, words and mind, kind of ruminating on in this phase. So many incredible songs. The more straight ahead fare kind of early on, Life, Night, and Hide Nowhere. There's a few atmospheric songs in terms of Sister and 3 a.m. And then from there, they get to bigger, more elongated songs in the wake of Voices in the Fan, Regulator, Funeral, Bastard, and then, not to be left out, what I would call an absolute death blow of a song, The Death of Music. And I dare you, try to listen to that song and think about people that you've lost and not start crying. I dare you to try, because it is a kind of a super unusual one, but that is someone bearing their soul in the face of loss and how to grip with mortality and to go on with all of that struggling around in their brain. This has always lived on in my mind as one of those records I come back to every so many months, maybe like every 8 or 9 months. It's not something I'll have on rotation every single day, but every now and again, I just have to come back to it. And it is luminous and such a big record, such a long record. It isn't one you can just pop in and be done with in 25 minutes. I mean, this is a full album and a full journey, but it is lush, it is patient, it is interesting. Every little idea feeds into what the idea is. And most importantly, which is why Devin hasn't often performed this stuff as a part of his Devin Townsend project or Devin Townsend bands. And there have been, like in Plovdiv, Bulgaria, a few years ago before the pandemic, there have been performances of the entire album. They also did at least a couple shows, I believe, in London, where they did the entire album, from front to back in sequence. But effectively, it is one of those things where he's always described it as one of the things most nearest and dearest to his heart. And you can tell when you listen to the record. This feels cut raw from the heart and soul of a person. And that's a part of what makes it so moving. You're getting unvarnished impressions. You're getting effectively everything that is what this person was really, really feeling, raw and uncut, without any notion of filter or pretense. And that's what makes it so gripping. That's what makes it so relatable. It may not be for everyone, but I can say for my part, whenever I have those moments where there's just too much going on and I need to be able to just submerge myself in something, this is one of those albums. A Perfect Circle's 13th Step is probably a comparable one, though that is in its own way almost more moody and sad. But this is about as good a record as I have ever heard. It is absolutely worth a listen. And if you're even a casual fan of things like this, if you have any interest in something like this, or if you're a person, like I say, who liked a lot of that mid to late 90s Soundgarden material, this is absolutely worth checking out. Such a brilliant, incredible record. And again, if you were to find it now, it's probably going to be listed under Devin Townsend, and then the album will be called Ocean Machines, Biomech. Whereas in the old days, for those of us who got it in that first wave, it was always credited as a band identity as Ocean Machines, and the album was called Biomech. And of course, this was common in the early to mid 90s, especially in industrial music bands. There was people constantly having numerous different projects and having different names for them, and kind of the fun was chasing people through these different projects, whereas nowadays maybe people don't do that as much. And so effectively Devin essentially came to the conclusion that he was rebranding the project under his own moniker for ease of use. So if you're going to look for it, you'll probably find it under Devin Townsend. But that is it for episode 30 of This Week is Live. Want to thank you again for joining us and for engaging with our content anywhere you do, whether it's here on Twitch when we broadcast live or when we basically upload these to YouTube after the week after on Tuesday or Wednesday following that, or in the many places we post clips of these on social media, whether it's in Instagram in Reels or in Facebook or in YouTube Shorts. We thank you for engaging us there. If you don't already, please follow us on Twitch, subscribe to us on YouTube, and we're going to be, like I say, on hiatus for the next couple of weeks, and then we will return. And after that, after the next 2 weeks are done, when we're back, we will basically have these episodes every Thursday, roughly around this time, 5:30 p.m. Pacific. And, we have that same format. We'll broadcast live on Thursdays, and then we'll have the show uploaded to YouTube Tuesday or Wednesday the week after it. So that's all for this time. Thanks for joining us. So glad to see you well.